Welcome to the Lighthouse Baptist Church Podcast. Today, Pastor Luke Shope will be continuing our journey through the book of Romans. God's desire for us is to be free from sin. That can only happen through Jesus Christ. The book of Romans is a powerful resource that shows us that Jesus Christ is the only way to spiritual freedom.
Welcome to this episode of Meaningful Moments with God. My name is Luke Shope, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about a bit of a hot-button issue. My goal today is to keep my opinion and preference out of the conversation as much as possible and just stick to the biblical principles we see the Apostle Paul putting forth. Today, we're going to talk about love and government. The Apostle Paul is taking another step here in his journey of telling us how the gospel should dictate absolutely everything in our lives. And in chapter 13 of Romans, Paul begins talking about our responsibility to earthly government. One of the very first things Paul brings out here is that these authorities that he's talking about were appointed by God. In chapter 12, Paul was talking about the believer's spiritual relationships in the church, but now he's going into our reaction to human government in verses 1 through 7 of chapter 13. There's a reason for this. The believer's spiritual relationships in the church are as much a matter of divine revelation as his relationship to human government. The gospel should penetrate every part of our life, not just the church part. The responsibility of a nation's leaders are both Godward and manward. Now, there are clearly rare occasions when a Christian must respectfully decline to obey a government order. But the Bible as a whole frowns on civil disobedience. God is always on the side of constitutional authority. We are to give earthly government the honor, and Paul says the taxes, which are due them. I believe Paul shows us here that government has a couple God-given aspects to it. The first thing here is he tells us government is appointed by God. The powers that be are ordained of God. It was instituted all the way back in Genesis chapter 9. As with most things, anything that God has given to humans, the humans didn't handle it well. We see that illustrated at the Tower of Babel. But despite the abuse of power, human government is still a divine institution. The word powers here in this passage means delegated authority. The word ordained simply means appointed. Here's something that is great to remember when elections roll around. The people get the kind of government they deserve. This was true in the Old Testament, and it's still true today. But no matter what kind of government we have, God still moves his own plan forward. Democracies and dictatorships, they are all under God's control. The tapestry that God is weaving through our history, our present and future, is perfect. The Bible even says in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 26, the heavens do rule. The whole Bible and its history is intended to reinforce the truth that the powers that be are ordained of God. Not only are they appointed by God, but they are approved by God. Disobedience to government authority is disobedience to God, and it will be judged. If a law is unjust, it must be repealed through legal channels, not just disobeyed. On the other hand, those in positions of authority must recognize the fact that their authority is derived from God. They are not appointed to advance their own self-interest or even to promote themselves. They are there to represent God's rule on earth. Regardless of whether they serve God or not, they discharge functions which are ordained by God. Jesus and his disciples never disobeyed government for personal reasons. When they disobeyed, it was to follow God's moral laws and standards. Their disobedience, by the way, didn't come cheap. They were threatened, beaten, thrown in jail, tortured, executed for their convictions. So if we're compelled to disobey, we have to be ready to accept the consequences for that. The Christian citizen is to fear and obey the government as long as the government does not demand citizens to violate God's word. Key word there is demand citizens to violate God's word. Our submission to government will usually take the form of obedience. Our submission to them must always be a reflection of our attitude and submission to God. Talks about that, Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20. So how can we make a difference? What is the Christian supposed to do? Well, the Christian should take advantage of the opportunities that God gives them to make a difference in their government. The most obvious one that I can think of would be that this implies that Christians should vote. It's the easiest way we can be involved in our government. Government has the function of protection. The moment Adam sinned, it was obvious that civilization would need some form of restraint and role to protect citizens from themselves. An example of this function is seen in Acts chapter 21, verses 27 through 37, when Roman soldiers stepped in and saved Paul from being murdered by his own countrymen. Government also has the function of punishment. Both Paul and Peter bring this out. Paul writes that duly appointed human officials are to be regarded as God's servants and that they should bear the sword that is to impart punishment upon criminals. Human government is to promote the general welfare of the community when its laws are in effect. Paul commanded us to pray for our human leaders. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 2 tell us the same thing. God sometimes, for his own purposes, places even wicked men in positions of power. Paul was in prison and finally executed under the rule of Emperor Nero, yet he never counseled rebellion or disobedience except when human law demanded that Christian go against God's ultimate law. This idea of obligation is the hinge that connects Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 to Romans chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. In verse 8 of chapter 13, Paul isn't telling us to pay cash for everything, but he's talking about the Christian's social responsibility of not acting in such a way toward his fellow man that he incurs any debt other than to love him. The debt of love is never paid up. In verse 11, it says, salvation is the final victory over sin and death that believers will experience when Jesus returns in his glory. In verses 12 through 13, the day there speaks of the Old Testament predicting the day of the Lord, and this is when God's ultimate plan is culminated. It also talks here about light and daytime and associates that with good. It speaks of darkness and nighttime and associates that with evil. Believers belong to the day, and we avoid the works of darkness. I see the word sleep there. The word sleep means that we're insensitive to the demands of Christ in the Christian life. Remember, the gospel should penetrate every part of our life. That includes our private life. That includes the way we think, the way we conduct ourselves, and even what we say towards civil government. Listen, Jesus is soon going to return. So now is the time to put on the deeds of light and cast off works of darkness. We can do this by refusing to make provision for the flesh, and then put on the actions and attitude of Jesus Christ. What does your social media say about your attitude towards civil government? You say, well, there are policies. Well, now, wait a second here. Either God put them in the place that they are, or he did not. Either you believe that or you don't believe that. God is all powerful. Nothing happens without his say-so. Nothing happens without his allowance. So here's how we can bring this around and feel better about what's going on in our culture. If God allowed leadership to be there, then ultimately it is for our good and his glory. Just like everything else we're talking about in the book of Romans, chapter 13 is no different. For our good, his glory. You can look back through the Old Testament, and chapter after chapter after chapter, you will see that God allowed evil kings, evil leaders to prevail because of the condition of his people. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm hearing a lot more about how we should be on our faces before God now than I was 4 years ago at this time. Now, that's just an observation. God should have the preeminence in every situation, and that includes politics. God is in control. He knows what he's doing. God never has an uh-oh moment. God was not surprised about any event in the past month or in the past century. It's all been orchestrated by Him. So you can rest in the fact today that God knows what He's doing, He's got a plan, and you're part of it. What a great day to be alive and serve the Lord. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us today for the Lighthouse Baptist Church Podcast. We hope that this resource is a blessing and encouragement to you as you live your life for Christ. If we can be of further help to you, please don't hesitate to email us at podcast@lighthousewinc.com. Lighthouse Baptist Church is located in Winchester, Virginia, and you can find out more at www.lighthousewinc.com.